quick review for yesterday. Make sure this thing's working. It is working good. What is the dominant migration? How's that? Is that better for light? Yeah. Okay. What is the dominant migration theory of the 20th century? Pre-Columbian migration theory. Yes, Emily. Say it again.
I don't know how to say it.
I'm sorry. You know what? I've got the wrong class. I'm thinking history. Let me rephrase this question. Doggone it. What is the defect in humanity, Emily?
Defect in humanity?
Yes. What does St. Augustine call the defect in humanity? Libido dominate. The lust to dominate. Because of this defect in humanity, again, according to Augustine, according to John Locke, and many other philosophers, the reason for this defect is what? What's the origins of this defect? That's the reason for government. Why does humanity have this problem? This lust to dominate over other people? You bet it does. Actually, with theology, not religion. Huh?
They sinned and they created the lust.
Yes, and in the proper term, it is called the original fall, or the fall of man. That's more of a proper term. It's a theological term from a Judeo-Christian perspective. We are all part of that perspective. We are part of Western civilization. And based on Western civilization, the fall of man, which occurred when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, that ushered in this thing that in theological terms is called sin. Okay? Because of this, and that has created a defect in our humanity, that we now have this desire to dictate to other people how to live their lives. The lust to dominate. That is the defect in humanity. That is the background behind that ideal. Now again, I said this yesterday. I'm going to say it again today. I'm not asking you to believe that. That is up to you. I'm not here to shake your faith system or even if you have one. But the reason this is important is because the people who developed our government system believed this. And therefore, they put things in place to protect against it. Now, what is the purpose of government? Now that we've laid that foundation, what is the purpose of government? The first and foremost purpose.
Protect people from each other?
Yes, to protect each other from each other because of this defect in humanity. All right, now we're going to start moving into what I call the Four Liberty Documents. Our Constitution, our founding fathers did not create something out of thin air. Okay, this is a piece that I believe is missing greatly in society. Understanding that our liberty, what's the difference between liberty? Yeah, what's the difference between liberty and freedom?
Morality.
That's right. Freedom plus morality gives you liberty. Our liberty that we have as Americans in this country, and I say that differently than to say those who live here because non-citizens do not enjoy 100% the same constitutional rights that citizens do. The Supreme Court has ruled that multiple times, that in order to enjoy all of the rights and privileges that Americans have, you have to be a citizen. Which, when we get into, let's see, this is government, we will get into immigration discussion, and there's an issue there. And you'll see that play out in the news and in the media and public opinion. But there is a legal system that, in some ways, non-citizens do not get the same constitutional rights. They get almost all of them, don't get me wrong. It's not like a big, wide difference. But there are some things that is not afforded to non-citizens. I need to go and research it before I really speak to it. I know there is, and I don't remember right offhand what it is. Part of it is due process. There is a due process non-citizens get, but they don't get the full due process. So, and to be very clear, I need to do a little bit of research before I really go into that. I don't want to be misspoken on it. All right. There are 4 documents in English history that leads us to our Constitution. You're going to need to be able to list these 4 and the main provisions in each of these documents. What you should be looking for as we discuss this today, maybe into Monday, and we'll try to get it done today, is the connections to some of the rights and privileges we have today. You should also start making some connections with whatever knowledge you already have coming into this class on the Revolutionary War. You should see that, wait a minute, I've heard something about representation, taxation without representation, in the Revolutionary War. You will see that our founding fathers were not arguing a new right. They weren't being spoiled brats, but were reasserting their natural-born English rights and their ancient rights. In fact, 918 years old. And some people, I would typically do this, but I wanted to narrow it down because we don't have a full semester to teach this. Our first liberty document is actually the 10 Commandments. But I don't have time to go all the way back to the original, all the documents. And this, by the way, this 4 is not hard and fast. Other teachers, other professors might add 1 or 2 more, 3 or 4 more. Most certainly would add the 10 Commandments into it. But just understand, I'm not trying to skip the 10 Commandments or even the importance of it. It's greatly important, because actually Western civilization actually starts in Mesopotamia. The Judeo-Christian culture and theology starts Western Civ. So all of us, whether we like it or not, are part Jewish in heritage, we are Christian in heritage, we are Roman in heritage, and Greek in heritage. And then the last heritage piece would be Great Britain. So I don't have time to splice all of that. That'd take me a week to splice those different heritages together to explain what it means to be an American or even a member of Western Civ, which we all are. Even those of you who might have immigrated from Mexico, you are part of Western Civ. We are part of the same civilization. So either way, that's where we come from. So, but I do want you to understand these 4 liberty documents. All right, so let's jump over here to where our ideals of liberty comes from. Well, we've already talked a little bit about it. What I call the tap root, those of you who work the fields understand what a tap root is, I assume. The tap root of a plant is that center, thick root that goes typically straight down into the ground. It's what anchors the plant into the ground. And then all the roots coming off of it are feeder roots. They're going out to get water, they're going out to get nutrients. But the tap root is a very important fact. A carrot is a tap root. The little hairs that come off a carrot, those are feeders. But a carrot itself is a tap root of that plant. Gives you a really strong idea what that looks like. Our heritage of liberty, I'm not going to say freedom because, again, freedom can be the absence of morality. The heritage of our liberty in this class, we're going to start back 918 years.
It can't be Greek. It's older than that.
Right. It's not Greek. What we get out of the Greeks is really the idea of democracy, that everybody gets to vote. Everybody who meets the qualification gets to vote. So British history. We got to start with understanding a little bit about British history. The British people is made up of Germanic tribes. made up of three groups: the Anglos, the Saxons, and Jutes. You might have heard in your lifetime this phrase, Anglo-Saxons. You might have even heard of a phrase that is typically abbreviated as a WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. When you're dealing with groups of people, particularly in academia, they will characterize individuals, particularly somebody of European descent, non-Catholic, as a WASP. And so when you hear people discuss race issues, white privilege, they have replaced the ideal of the WASP with just all whites. It used to be WASP privilege, if you want to call it that way. Now it's all whites.
Let's see if I can remember. The Angles were there first, then the Saxons came, then the Jews from Denmark.
We're going to find it. I think these guys are first.
What?
Yep, Jutes came from, they don't last very long. But three different Germanic tribes show up. Here's kind of their patterns of migration. At one time, the Germanic tribes, now keep in mind, this now is the Norway, Sweden, those areas, Denmark, but that's not who was up there at the time. The Jutes came from the northern section of Scandinavia, and they actually sailed all the way down here to the south towards London. Then you got the Angles migrated into the middle section, the Saxons did, and then you got the Angles went north. Now what's interesting is that you could go there today and they still have different dialects from this long ago. We're talking about 450 AD. They still have different dialects. We do have some intermixings between the Jutes and the Saxons, but for the most part, they stayed separate. Of course, they came across differently. By the time the Anglos and Saxons showed up, there wasn't a whole lot of Jutes left. And by the way, I'm probably not pronouncing Jutes correctly. Doesn't matter in this class. I'm sure it matters to Jutes, but if I ever run into one, which I don't think they exist anymore, they've been bred out, if you will. I guess I'll be corrected then, but just understand, three different Germanic groups. So if you put anything in notes, understand that the British Isles were originally settled by three Germanic tribes: the Anglos, the Saxons, and the Jutes.
And then you got it, and then before that it was the Romans, and then the people who were there are the Britons.
These are the Britons. These become the Brits.
Wait, so who were the people the Romans invaded before that?
At the same time period. Romans came, in fact, the Romans came, about 200, 300 AD, and were there for, 100 or 200 years. They left around 450 AD at the collapse of the empire. So they're dealing with not just the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes, but they're also dealing with those indigenous Druid type people that we don't really know anything about. There's no written record of them. Celts are further north, up towards what we'd call Ireland today. So, but there's no written record, so there's very little knowledge of them. There's only a lot of speculation. So, see, that's the thing about history. History is only when there's written record. When there's no written record, it's called archaeology. As soon as you get written record, it switches. Now, you can have historical archaeology, where you take written record and do your digs to find out more. But when you're dealing with a civilization with no written record, it is not history. It is only archaeology. So that's why we don't know a whole lot, and I'm not going to talk a lot about them, because we don't have a lot of written record of the Jutes. We have a lot more of the Anglo-Saxons, because they established a very organized government system. In fact, that's where we get the shires. If you think about the Lord of the Rings, shires, those who are in charge of the shires are today called sheriffs. That's where we get the word sheriff. You have barons who were major landowners. They were like governors or maybe what we would call mayors, or well, like in Canyon County, we don't have one individual who oversees the county. We have the county commissioners. So a lot of that structure is being put into place and perfected under the Anglo-Saxons. But everything changes at 1066. You will want to put this down. 1066, William of Normandy. Where have we heard the word Normandy before? Yes, Brett?
D-Day.
D-Day, Normandy, France. We have the King of Normandy. At this time, France is not one country. In fact, it doesn't exist. It's in kingdoms like every other place in Europe. The King of Normandy, the Kingdom of Normandy, invades England. And he defeats the Anglo-Saxons. The King of Normandy is also known as William the Conqueror. So if you hear that in history, on the History Channel, whatever, they are the same individuals. He's also known as William I, King of England. Of course, he becomes king once he defeats them. Over time, he eliminates most of the ruling nobles, the Anglo-Saxons nobles, but he centralizes the control of the shires and keeps their administrative structure in place. So he does not totally eradicate the Anglo-Saxon system, or their language for that matter. The Battle of Hastings is the main battle. That's historically, there's only about 5 major battles prior to World War I or World War II that changes the world. This is one of them. And for our purposes, this is the first one. The Battle of Hastings is a major incident. I did that yesterday too. Oh, it should be of, not foe, of the shires. You might find a few typos like that. I tried to fix them this weekend, but I didn't catch them all. Maybe over 5 years I'll get them all. So, after, 15, 20 years, William I dies, and this strapping young man, his son, William II, ascends to the throne. His real name or birth name is William Rufus, but his English title is William II. Oh, let me back up here a little bit here. I'll let you write that. Just listen to what I have to say here. So William II is not a very nice guy. He continues the consolidation of the Anglo-Saxon system under him, including involvement in the church. He wants to be the one appointing all the bishops. Of course, if the king appoints you, who are you going to be loyal to? The king. If he has the power to appoint and remove, you're going to do the king's bidding, not necessarily what God says. That's a problem for the church. The church does not, and at this time it's a Catholic church. It's the only option you have. The bishops, the cardinals, the priests are all takes their marching orders from who? Or should? The Pope in Rome. William I doesn't think so. He thinks, no, I should have the power to do this, and you should do what I want you to do. And that causes a big rift. He also likes this thing called taxation. And he taxes everything, including what we today call a death tax. More appropriately, it's an inheritance tax. If your parents work their tails off and make a couple good decisions, they could end up dying wealthy, very wealthy. Under his system, you'd have to pay a tax on that before you ever got it. We got that system today. And the people were not happy with him. No, in fact, there was a series of events that nearly killed him. Suspicious. They're not sure what was going on there. And one day he was out on a hunting trip. Perhaps it was his brother. They're not too sure about that. But there was a freak accident that happened and he dies. His brother, Henry the First, takes the throne. It is thought he was probably behind it. Nonetheless, he takes the throne. He wants to gain some favor of the people. So he says, you know what? We're going to issue what's now called, this is your first liberty document, the 1100 Charter of Liberties. What my brother was doing was evil and oppressive. Evil and oppressive. That will be on a test. What was William II doing? Or how did they characterize his actions? As evil, and I'm quoting this, and oppressive. We're going to talk about exactly what those were in just a minute. But the 1100 Charter of Liberties, why are they significant? It's the first written form of government for the English. It sets the stage for future written agreements in terms of governing system, and eventually leads to our Constitution. The 1100 Charter of Liberties is the first written mode of government for the English people. And it makes the king subject to certain laws regarding what he and his men does. Before then, you had this thing called, and this will always be a problem in English life, it's a problem with all royalty, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The lust to dominate. We have two sets of rules for kings and people. The king is typically above the law. They're saying, in this agreement, the king is not above the law, and neither is his men. Now, Henry I doesn't follow this very well. In fact, most kings don't. But it is for the first time acknowledged, and the king signs it, that he is to not only uphold the law for him and his men, but that the people do have certain rights. And in particular, he's to leave the church officials alone. They are independent of the government system. Do you hear any connection to today's system? Maybe our First Amendment? First time this idea that the king is separate from the theological system.
Oh, the separation of church and state.
There you go. Okay. They referred to the practices of William II as oppressive and evil. What was those practices? Overtaxation, corruption, and oppressive rule. We're going to keep coming back to this for the next 918 years. Overtaxation, corruption, and oppressive rule. That's what William II was doing that was deemed to be evil and oppressive. Test question, test question, test question. What were the practices of William I that was considered evil and oppressive? Overtaxation, corruption, and oppressive rule. And part of that overtaxation is the inheritance tax issue. So the king, the way he was doing this, he wanted more of the land for himself. So if you, the son of that wealthy landowner, could not pay the tax, that meant the king would get the property, which most people couldn't pay a tax. Not as much as they were taxing. That was all deliberate. Okay, we've already talked about this a little bit. This charter planted the seeds of liberty in the hearts and minds of the people. For the first time, they recognize they have some of these rights. We're not just living our lives at the whim of the king, but we have certain rights, and the king has acknowledged that. Now, like I said, William I does not follow through on this. He almost immediately starts violating it. But it doesn't leave the minds of the people. Now, keep in mind, this is not necessarily for the peasants. There is a class system. The upper class, the barons, the nobles, landowners, this most certainly applies. But if you're just a peon peasant farmer, sharecropping or something, it's a little different system for you. But this starts to set the stage for the next 918 years. All right, so when you hear of the story of Robin Hood, what do you think of? Do you think of this guy? Or maybe Kevin Costner or one of those other Hollywood movies? What is the story in one sentence of Robin Hood? Bandit, go ahead. Steals from the bad, gives to who? To the good. Who is the bad in the story? The rich. Who is the bad, or who's the good? The poor. That's wrong. You're right. That's what you've been taught. That story has been perverted into an anti-capitalism story. But that is not the real story. I actually have a copy of the original story. The story actually goes like this. Robin Hood steals from the king who is overtaxing the people and giving it back to the people who he took it from. That is not taxing the rich and giving to the poor. That's taking from the government, a tyrannical government, something of which does not belong to the government, and giving it back to those who it does belong to. That's the real story of Robin Hood. Now here's the thing. Nobody really knows if this guy actually existed. There are several stories in English, are written in English, the legal, when they did their court systems, it's kind of like what we do today. There's a written record of who was charged and for what and that kind of stuff. There are several people, individuals, who resemble this story, but no historian will come down and say there is a one Robin Hood, and this is more or less a story of, it's a moral lesson is what it is, against a tyrannical government system, but it's a collection of myths and ideals. Okay, just understand, most of your Disney movies has been perverted from the original meanings. Even The Wizard of Oz, it's not what you think it is. But anyways, now let's see who's calling. Mr. Moffat? Okay. Would you go see Miss Kaplan, Brian? All right, the next Liberty document. It's the Magna Carta of 1215. Most classes would start with this document. But we actually don't get this document without the 1100 Charter of Liberties. This document, well, we'll get to it here in a little bit. I don't want to spill the beans just yet. But, like I said, 1100 Charter of Liberties were ignored by most of the monarchs, including Henry I. But in 1213, something came up. King John, which is known in your Robin Hood story as Little John, King John wants to appoint the bishops. Who's going to be bishops in the church? Among some other things. But the key point here is that he wants to control who's going to be in church leadership. Archbishop Stephen Langton and the Pope disputed the king's position. This went on for quite a while, and Stephen Langton, the archbishop, he's running a risk. He's running a risk of being executed for defying the king. But he's standing his ground. So here on this slide, the key thing for you to understand is that the 1100 church liberties were ignored by most kings. But in 1213, Archbishop and the Pope has a dispute over with King John over the church appointments. Those are the two main points on here that you should understand. Quickly write, quickly write. Okay, I cannot speak Latin for the life of me, but Magna Carta Liberatum, I know I'm not saying that correct. It's the Great Charter of Liberties. That's what that word means, all those three words. The Great Charter of Liberties, just understand, I'm not going to ask you to what does Magna Carta Liberatum mean? I'm not going to ask you to do that on the test. Understand it is considered the Great Charter. There are other Magna Cartas, but the Magna Carta of 1215 is the primary one. It was signed by King John on June 15th, 2015. We just passed the 800-year anniversary of it. And by the way, as you'll see in the next slide, he did not want to do this. Because what happened was that Stephen Langton, being an educated man, remembered, wait a minute here, don't we, boy, it seemed like to me, we have certain rights that the king agreed to. Oh yeah, the 1100 Charter of Liberties. And one of those things in here says the king is not above the law and that he is to be free from church involvement. Stephen Langton takes that to the barons and reminds them of their ancient rights. Remember, this is over 100 years since the signing of that document, 4 generations. They remind the barons, you have legal rights to not only your land, to proper taxation, proper governance, but most importantly, from a theological perspective, free from government intrusion in the church. The barons take that document to the king and says, you will either abide by this or we will go to war. So you'll see in this picture here, got Stephen Langton right there in the middle in the red garb. You got a baron here saying, you will sign here, King John. Notice he's got his sword on. It came close to going to war, and he's not happy about it, is he? This is an actual painting of that time period. This is the actual document, by the way. They have it. I think they made 4 copies, hand copies, and this is wax, by the way. It's like a wax seal, but you can go to Great Britain to their National Museum there and see it. It is like our Constitution. It is under, I don't even know if a nuclear bomb could blow it out of its container. It's very well sealed, and it goes down into a vault each night when they close like our Constitution does. So, very important document. But he reminded the barons, you have ancient rights. Assert them. You're not creating something new. You're not even being disrespectful to the king. These are yours. And the barons said, oh my gosh, that's right. We forgot about these. So they signed the Magna Carta. What's in the Magna Carta? Well, first of all, understand the significance of the Magna Carta. I'll write that in your notes. The significance of the Magna Carta is that most constitutions today are based on this document. Most constitutions in the world is based on this document. And it has its provisions, the roots of its provisions start in the 1100 Charter of Liberties. Are you seeing dots being connected here? Now, we haven't got into the provisions of the Magna Carta yet, but you should start seeing some dots starting. We've got about 2 or 3 dots now on paper that you should be able to start drawing lines to. So if I ask you on the test, what is the significance of the Magna Carta? The significance is of the Magna Carta, and I'm in a complete sense, the significance of the Magna Carta 1215 is most constitutions in the world today are based on it. That is the significance. Now, I would hope you would extend on that and then draw into our own Constitution as you learn more about it today. But that is the first, and that's your thesis statement right there. I would expect you to tell me how it's connected to the 1100 Charter of Liberties. The 3 primary things we still get from this document today. Oh, by the way, let me back up. One of the first statements in the Magna Carta reasserts all of the rights in the 1100 Charter of Liberties. So the Magna Carta does not stand alone. It says, in addition to the 11, and I'm paraphrasing, in addition to all the rights and liberties asserted in the 1100 Charter of Liberties, the following also apply. And the 3 that we care about today is parliamentary government. For the first time, we have representative government. So when you hear the word parliamentary government, that is the same thing as representative government. We don't use representative government at this time frame yet. It's called parliamentary government. But for the first time in English law, we have parliamentary government, representative government. We also, for the first time, have taxation through representation, which comes through parliamentary government. And we also have due process rights. You cannot just throw somebody in prison now. That individual now has a right to challenge that incarceration. He has a right to know why he's in prison, and he has a right to a trial. Due process. All of these things that we have today, we enjoy these things. In fact, you want to have a civil war in this country, deprive some of these. Oh, wait a minute, that happened in 1776. We have these today because of this document. Now, we're going to talk about natural law soon. So it's actually encompassed. That's why we go back to the 10 Commandments in a normal class, because all of this is wrapped up into our humanity. We'll talk about that, at least when we get to the Bill of Rights. So, quick review. We got the Anglo-Saxons and the Jewett migration. We end up with the 1066 Battle of Hastings. Leads us to William I and those activities. William II, his evil and oppressive rule. Henry I, which leads us to the 1100 Charter of Liberties. We get King John and his stepping into the church issues. The Archbishop Stephen Langton, understanding his history, understanding his legal rights, leads us to the Magna Carta of 1215. So if I ask you maybe in one sentence to explain to me the Liberty documents, this is how I would expect you to write it out in this flow. Cause and effect relationships. That's something you should be thinking about here when you write this chart out. We got the start of the migration, the Germanic tribe migration. What is the effects of that? Well, we end up getting the Battle of Hastings. What is the effects of that? We get William I, And it's like a domino effect, okay? Cause and effect relationships. What is the significance of these individual events? Remember, none of these events happen in isolation. You out of here? What's that? Construction. How are you going to get government?
Third block.
Third block.
Yeah. Third block until third.
Oh, in the spring. Okay.
Yeah.
See you then. None of these things occur by themselves. What's that? So one way to study for this is ask yourself, what is the significance of Henry I? Why do I care? Well, you may not, but for this class you need to, right? And you really should. You're members of our society. You're members of our civilization. You enjoy. Here's the beauty of this, ladies and gentlemen. We all have this inheritance of liberty because of what these people were willing to do. We are the beneficiaries of this. And you should know that if the government or somebody intrudes on your liberty, you can rest assured you have a solid foundation to push back and say, no, I have inherited rights. Our founding fathers did that. They understood this history. I don't think most Americans do today. I think they're very clueless about how ingrained this is in our DNA. And here's the thing: President Reagan, on his farewell address to the nation, right before his second term end, he talked to the youth, the teenagers at that time. I remember watching it. I was still a kid. I wasn't even junior high then. I think I was 6th or 7th grade, probably 7th grade. And he said, freedom is one generation away from being gone. One generation. And freedom in this country can be gone. And he calls out the youth. If your teachers and your parents aren't teaching you this, call them out on it. And I don't think we've been teaching the principles of liberty for a long time in this country. We have, rest assured, we have solid foundation to stand on, even you at your age. All right, who's still writing this? All right. Yes?
Oh, and I have a written answer, so who's still writing?
Well, you're not writing, so are you writing?
I thought you just meant in general, like the entirety of the
Oh, no. I'm worried about so we can move on to the next slide.
We're good.
Okay. All right. So that's halfway through. That's 2 of the documents. The Petition of Right. The document we're going to worry about here is the Petition of Right of 1628. But we've got an issue of Parliament that we've got to deal with. The Petition of Right of 1628 is the third liberty document. So we got Charles I here, 1625. And if you'll notice, about every 150 years, 1625, about every 150 years or so, we have another crisis in English history that brings us either to a war or a potential war. Even in our own nation, you'll notice from the time the American Revolution occurs to the time the Civil War occurs is about 150 years. And we are now due for another one if we stay with that 150-year pattern. Now, at this time, that the British Isles have been consolidated. He is known as King James. He's Charles I, but he's also known as King James VI and King James I. He's also known as the King of Scotland, as James VI. He's known as, in England and in Ireland, as James I. He's got multiple titles here. You don't need to know all of them. Just understand when you're dealing with British history, it is not just one individual, one title. They have different titles, different names in the different countries that they are king of. One thing, and I'm trying to make a connection to our culture, he's also the king that authorized the King James Bible. He does not like Puritans. He does not like separatists. And these individuals end up escaping with their lives, those who did get out of England. Many of them were killed and tortured. But they got out and went to Holland, and from there they ended up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, as individuals that we call as Puritans today. So when you think of Turkey Day and Thanksgiving, these are the same people. These people, the Puritans, are the ones who wanted to purify the church, clean up the corruption. At this time, by the way, we have two different Christian denominations. You have Protestants and you have Catholics. Well, before this time, Henry VIII, or is it the fifth? I think it's Henry VIII. It is the 8th, because he wants to divorce his wife because she won't give him a male son. At that time, nobody knew it's the male that determines the sex of the baby, not the female. So in order to get a divorce, he has to get permission from the Pope. The Pope says that is not a justification for a divorce. He goes, oh yeah, we'll see about that. He starts his own church, makes him the head of the church, and today that is called the Church of England. So at this time period, we have the Church of England. Very Catholicistic, very Catholic-like. It's really hard to tell the difference, but they are considered Protestant. The only difference that he really did in the Church of England is made him the head of the church, not the Pope. So even today, the King of England, the Queen of England is the head of the church over there. Today, the American version of the Church of England is called the Anglican Church, which many of our founding fathers, like George Washington, was a member of. But Charles I, or King James, he has a problem. He married a Catholic French woman, French princess. So Parliament, who's mostly members of the Protestant denomination, is very, very suspicious of him, very suspicious of her. They think he's going to be sympathetic to the Catholic Church, probably sympathetic to the Catholic French, which is their long-term mortal enemies, and they even suspect he will try to change the Church of England and move it back to Catholicism. So there's a big rift between Parliament and the king. And lo and behold, like I said, he marries a French Roman Catholic princess. But in 1627, there's a civil war in France against the Huguenot family clan, which is Catholic, and the Protestant group. I can't remember the Protestant group, not important. He sends the Duke of Buckingham with a lot of money, government money, taxes, over to France to help pay for the war, to basically help support the Huguenots. And the Protestant Parliament went ballistic. They immediately impeached the Duke of Buckingham and charged the king with treason. How dare you support the Catholics? Never mind that they're French in the first place. This triggers a war between Parliament, it's called the Parliamentarians, and the Cavaliers. The Cavaliers are those who supported the king, and the Parliamentarians are the Protestants who supported Parliament. So you literally have a civil war between Parliament, their representative government, and the king himself. He escapes with his army to Scotland, thinking, Scots, they're Catholic, they'll help me out. They capture him and turn him over to Parliament. All right, so Parliament ends up saying, look, you're either going to comply and provide us this petition of rights, or we will execute you. The king agrees under duress, and it sets forth the following protected liberties. 1, taxes can only be levied by Parliament. See, what he did is he disbanded Parliament and then levied taxes himself. In the Magna Carta, the king had the authority to call Parliament into session and disband it. So for many years, he did not allow Parliament to meet, and he just levied taxes himself and sent his own supporters in to collect. So in the petition of right, one of the first things they do, by the way, what they do in all of these documents is reassert the previous document. The Charter of Liberties and the Magna Carta still stand, and we want these. First one's the taxes can only be levied by Parliament. Martial law could not be imposed in peacetime. In other words, when you issue martial law orders, all civil liberties are suspended. If the president or governor ever issue martial law or declare martial law, our Constitution, either state or federal, is set aside. They could arrest you for any reason, detain you for any reason, you get no due process, nothing. Sometimes you need to do that in a time of war, in a time of crisis. When you, down in New Orleans, when they had the big hurricane during President Bush's administration, they had to declare martial law because there was no government system in place to protect people. So if you were seen like at midnight at night, you were assumed to be a criminal and you would be arrested as soon as you were caught. You could also be shot for that matter. A lot of people were. Of course, a lot of those people who were trying to rob and kill people. Prisoners must be able to challenge their detentions through what's called a writ of habeas corpus. Through a writ of habeas corpus, you have to declare why, as the government, why the individual has been arrested. You could not be arrested and not know why. Troops may not be quartered against the will of the residents. So what the king was doing, because he wanted to make sure he knew what was going on, he would send his military in and make them live in the houses of those in Parliament who was against him, so that they would keep tabs on you. And of course, when a soldier would come in your house, who got the best bed? The soldier did. Who got the best food? Soldier did. Who did all the laundry for the soldier? You did. In fact, you may end up living in the barn because his whole group might take over your house. And you had to pay for it all. So first time in our history, ours being because we are British at this time, first time in our history as a nation, we're not a nation yet, don't get me wrong, what I'm saying is in our heritage, you cannot have troops stay in someone's home without their permission. And we have a provision against the violation of due process. I have a right to challenge my detention. I have a right to see the evidence. I have a right to stand a trial. Do any of these provisions sound familiar to you?
Yeah.
I sure hope so. They're identical to what we have today in our Bill of Rights. Do you see how the liberties that we have today are, as we go in history, as we go further along, they become more and more articulate? They're written out in more clear language? Should be. Do we need to go back?
Just the last thing.
Hang on. I don't know why it went one more. light works, but my clicker's not working. Let me know when you have it. Okay. Notice the assertion that the subjects had inheritance rights. In fact, they even wrote that word in the document. That they have inheritance rights. They were born into them. These are rights they already possessed, whether the king wanted to acknowledge it or not. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the bishop wars. That leads us to our next item. Charles I refused to call for Parliament for the next 10 years. Remember I said the king has to call into session Parliament? Well, he decides, okay, you want to do this? No, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to call into session Parliament. I'm going to tax you anyway through my guys, through my sheriffs, my tax collectors, and they start implementing new taxation. Hunting and fishing license, business license, occupational license. Every 5 years, I have to pay $75 to renew my occupational license. When I add my superintendent endorsement next summer, it'll cost me $75 to do that. To go fishing every year, I have to, on January 1st, go down and buy a hunting license and a fishing license. If I wanted to operate a business, I have to go buy not only a state license, but probably a county and a city license. The very things that's a violation of English rights then, we tolerate today. This was such a violation of English rights, it does not end well for the king. So the key thing here is to understand that for 10 years, the king would refuse to call Parliament into session. He needs taxes to operate his government, so he goes and implements new taxation to bypass Parliament. And you could give a couple examples. These are just 3 of many examples. I use these 3 because these are the things that we tolerate today. But the English people they don't tolerate this too terribly long. Notice though, 10 years. They didn't go to war right away. They didn't threaten the king right away. They endured. They tried to negotiate for a long time, much like our founding fathers. It was a good 10 years before the first bullets left the colonial muskets. Actually, I think it was about like 13 years. I would say just understand King Charles did not call Parliament into session for 10 years. He needs taxes to pay for his government. And so remember, who can tax? Who can levy taxes? Parliament. Well, Parliament's not in session. King needs money. So he bypasses Parliament and creates a new taxing mechanism, bypassing Parliament. Now, is this legal? No. No. But he's arguing, wait a minute, Magna Carta doesn't say anything about hunting license or fishing license. After all, it's my animals. Do I not have a right to charge if I'm going to let you? Because in most kingdoms, if you got caught shooting the king's animals, which they were all the king's animals, you could be executed for. So he's allowing a mechanism for people to do that. Remember, who's really doing the hunting? The barons, the dukes, those with the landowners, the ones who have money. You and I, the peasant farmers, we're raising a pig. We don't have the money to go buy a hunting license. And back then, hunting was not for survival. It was a sport. Only gentlemen hunted. It's not like hunting in our country where, especially when our settlers came here, it was all survival then. Not so back then. All right. Parliament, I have a tough time saying this word. Parliamentarians. These are the Protestants on Parliament. They're also called Roundheads. Kind of as a derogatory word for them. You have this group, and then we will tackle the other group. And then you have the second group called the Royalist. They're also known as the Cavaliers. The Royalists are the ones who are supported or who are supporting the king. They are often very fancy dressers. You're going to see the comparison between the two here in just a minute. The Cavaliers was a derogatory term that the Roundheads would use for the royalist. Later, the royalists took it as a badge of honor. And today, they're still called Cavaliers, and many of these Cavaliers migrated and established Virginia. Now, the Cavaliers play a huge role in our history when we get there. So just when we talk about the Cavaliers, really pay attention to their culture when we start talking about that, because that's going to play a huge role even still today in the South.
So is it going to be about the rich landowners in the South and then slavery and stuff like that?
A little bit, but that is a byproduct of another issue. The Cavaliers have this strong sense of duty. Strong sense of duty. You'll see that with George Washington. So, simple dress. They're not real fancy. These guys are often would be considered Calvinist, Puritans. Today, we don't really call people Calvinists. They're called Reformed theology. They are very doctrinally straight to what the Bible says. And one of the things is they don't think that it's best use of your money to buy real fancy clothes when it could be used elsewhere. And to be real flashy clothing is not it's drawing too much attention to yourself. And so they often will wear very plain clothing. The old style Quakers will wear black clothing. If you look at Mennonites or Amish, they have a very particular dress, and they don't use bright colors and flashy stuff to draw attention to themselves. And so it's the same thing with this guy. This is an actual painting of somebody of that time period. So we get a pretty good sense of how plain living they are. Okay? On the contrary, we have a Cavalier here. He's quite a dapper guy. He's a real kind of fancy guy. He's got all the fine linens, often silk, very spendy stuff. This is Prince Rupert of the Rhine. He is considered, like I wrote here, he's kind of the poster child of what the Cavaliers looked like back then. They often were the gentleman farmer, meaning they owned the farmland, but other people did the work. Okay? Gives you, and here we have a young man here. There's his sisters. There's his mother. He's being interrogated by a member of parliament here. Where is your dad, boy? We're looking for him, because they want to round him up. They've got a problem with him. because he's supporting the king. So a lot of people were executed and put in jail during this time period. So you got the daughter here crying, the boy here standing, probably saying, I don't know where he's at or whatever. So, all right. So, 1640. It kind of comes to a head here. This particular parliament, by the way, they're back in session. It's called the Long Parliament, after an individual who was kind of like the prime minister at the time. They believed that Charles was going to establish Catholicism in England once and for all and subject England to the dictates of a foreign power. This was considered treason. Now, he was doing just about everything he could to show them that this is in fact what he was going to do. Whether he really was or not, I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows. But he most certainly was taking all the actions that would indicate he in fact was going to do this. Why what? Well, he is it directly. But see, even when JFK was elected, people were really worried that he was not going to follow the Constitution, but follow what the Pope said. Where's the Pope? In Rome. That's the foreign power we're referring to. Yeah. So if you have to decide your conscience to the Word of God, i.e., in this case, to the Pope, because he represents Christ and God on earth, or the Constitution or the laws of England, if your conscience is heavier towards theology, and you really believe you have accountability system through Yahweh, God, and by disobeying the Pope, you're disobeying God, then the punishment for that's far worse. You see what I'm saying? So if you're truly Catholic, you're going to follow the Pope, the teachings of the Pope. Whereas if you are going to be secular, you're going to follow the dictates of the law, not what the Pope says. Am I making sense here? Okay. So that was a real concern of when JFK was the first Catholic president, and there was a huge concern for that. That was he really going to represent America, or was he going to represent the Pope? So, he almost didn't get elected because of it. And he almost didn't get the primary. Once he got the primary, then people got behind him because he was, again, young. He was the youngest president at the time to be elected. He was fairly good looking. His wife was gorgeous. They were like the Cinderellas. I mean, they were just classy, they just really changed we were in the middle of a cultural revolution in this country at that time period too. Any other time he probably would have not been elected. But it just so happens, fate being what it is, it was perfect timing for really a catastrophic change in the White House. Well, catastrophic for some, for others maybe not so much.
He was one of the better presidents in my opinion because he was trying to get the power back.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, by today's standards, he would have been considered a conservative Republican. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, that's how far left both parties have moved. So, oh yeah, he dropped the tax rate like Trump did. At that time, tax rate was 75%. He dropped it to 30 some odd percent. And we had a huge economic boom because of that. And then when President Carter was elected, he did the reverse and dumped us into a major recession where we had interest rates like at 20%. So, yeah, when you look at what he did and what he spoke of, you think you're looking at a Republican today. It's really incredible how everything has shifted. And we will talk about it in government class, how our entire political system have shifted to the left towards more dictatorship. What's that? Yep. Yeah, it's constantly changing, but definitely everything's moving to the left. That's why you're seeing more and more of a divide in our political philosophy. Those who stay strong to the Constitution, those individuals called kind of the right wing or the radical right. Well, they're staying to the Constitution. Well, if majority is going to the left further, away from freedom, more government intervention, then they're going to look like they're radicals. But when you read the Constitution, that's how it should be, if we're going to stay to the Constitution. And we're going to discuss the cause and effect and the ramifications from moving from the original intent of our founding fathers to the direction we are currently on now. There is a ramification for that. So, and the thing is, we the people get to make that decision. So, all right. So these were, again, kind of like a civil war between the two groups. We're not going to go into great detail, but I will just tell you that the parliamentarians win. They capture King Charles. There's a trial, and he is beheaded for treason. And he gives a very impassionate speech at the execution block, basically calling out the Protestants, the parliamentarians, for executing their king who God has put on the throne. And the evidence was not that good. Anyways, nonetheless, they took his head off. What's interesting, they sewed his head back on when they put him back in the casket to bury him. Yeah. Don't know why they would sew it on, but they did. They have actually exhumed him, and that's how they found out that there's stitches in all the way around his neck where they sewed him back on. So so for a while there was a constitutional republic established, or a republic that they called a commonwealth established. But a little bit later, about 10 years later, they restored Charles's son, Charles II, to the throne and reminded him, if you don't do what you need to be doing based on what we think, you'll end up like your dad. And the king said, okay, I'm picking up what you're putting down. So that's, off this slide, understand the king is executed for treason. For 10 years, we have a Commonwealth of England, which is a republic. And then in 1660, Charles II is restored to the throne. Those are the three main points on this slide. Holy cow, we're not going to get it done. We're close. We are very close. Let me know when I can move. We will pick up with the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights tomorrow. Okay?
Book 1, Sections 1 through 5 of Politics by Aristotle. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please